The morning sun glinted off the polished windows of Terminal 4, casting long, golden streaks across the departure's lounge. Elias Thorne adjusted the collar of his worn denim jacket, the fabric softened by years of use. He looked like any other traveler, slightly tired, carrying a nondescript leather duffel and wearing a pair of scuffed boots that had seen better days. He wasn't there for the scenery. As a federal air marshal, Elias was trained to be invisible, a ghost in the machinery of civil aviation. He moved through the security checkpoint with practiced ease, his credentials tucked discreetly away, his mind already cataloging the faces around him. When the boarding call for Flight 1422 to Los Angeles rang out, Elias joined the queue for Group 1. He held a first-class ticket, a necessary tactical placement for his assignment. "Excuse me," a sharp, high-pitched voice sliced through the low hum of the terminal. Elias didn't turn immediately. He was focused on a young man 2 rows ahead who was acting nervously. "Excuse me, sir." A firm tap, almost a shove, hit his shoulder. Elias turned slowly. Standing before him was a woman who seemed to radiate a sense of manufactured perfection. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful, and her designer tracksuit probably cost more than Elias' first car. She was clutching a miniature poodle in a bedazzled carrier and looking at Elias as if he were a smudge on her windshield. "The line for economy is back there," she said, pointing a manicured finger toward the end of the terminal. "This is priority boarding for first class." Elias offered a polite, tired smile. "I know, I'm in 3A. The woman's laugh was short and jagged. "3A, right, and I'm the Queen of Sheba. Look at you, you're wearing, whatever that is. This cabin is for people who contribute to the premium experience. People like you shouldn't be sitting in first class, it's a matter of standards." "I have my ticket, ma'am," Elias said quietly, his voice level. He didn't want a scene. Scenes drew attention, and attention was the enemy of his profession. "We'll see about that," she huffed, spinning on her heel as the gate agent beckoned. The pre-flight friction. The interior of the Boeing 737 was cool and smelled of industrial lemon cleaner. Elias settled into seat 3A, placing his duffel under the seat in front of him. He checked his peripherals. The cockpit door was to his front left, the galley to his right. A moment later, the woman appeared. She looked at her ticket, then at the seat next to Elias, 3B, her face contorted as if she had just smelled something rotting. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," she loudly announced to the cabin. She turned to a passing flight attendant, a young man named Marcus who looked like he'd already had a very long day. "Steward, there's been a mistake. I cannot possibly be expected to sit next to this. He's clearly in the wrong seat. He's probably a standby or a mechanic. Look at his clothes." Marcus glanced at Elias, who remained expressionless. "Ma'am, if the gentleman has a boarding pass for 3A, that is his seat. May I see your pass?" "It's Mrs. Gable," she corrected sharply. "And I pay for comfort. I pay for a certain environment. Having a man who looks like he just crawled out from under a truck sitting in the seat next to me is not what I paid for. People like him belong in the back where they can be among their own kind." Elias felt a flash of heat in his chest, not for himself but for the sheer, casual cruelty of her words. He thought of his father, a pipefitter who had worked 60-hour weeks to put Elias through college, often coming home covered in grease and grit. According to Mrs. Gable, his father wouldn't have been worthy of a comfortable chair either. "Ma'am," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, "I'd appreciate it if you'd sit down so we can depart on time. We all have places to be." "Don't you speak to me," she snapped. She spent the next 10 minutes loudly complaining on her phone about the deteriorating quality of air travel until the captain announced the cabin doors were closed. 30,000 feet. Once the seatbelt sign flicked off, the tension in first class settled into a cold war. Mrs. Gable took up as much of the shared armrest as humanly possible, occasionally sighing loudly or making noises whenever Elias moved to get a sip of water. Elias ignored her, his eyes were constantly scanning. He watched the man in 4D heavy sweating clutching a backpack. He watched the woman in 2C frequent trips to the restroom looking back over her shoulder. This was the job. The boredom was the hardest part, punctuated by the need for instant, violent readiness. An hour into the flight, the vibe changed. It started with a muffled shout from the back of the plane. Then, the sound of a tray table being slammed. Marcus, the flight attendant, came sprinting up the aisle, his face pale. He headed straight for the galley phone to call the cockpit. Suddenly, a man burst through the curtain separating economy from first class. He was tall, disheveled, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, misplaced energy. In his hand, he held a jagged piece of broken glass, the bottom of a wine bottle. "Nobody move," the man screamed. Open the cockpit door right now." The cabin plummeted into a terrifying silence, followed quickly by the sound of Mrs. Gable's sharp intake of breath. The intruder was shaking, the glass shard trembling in his grip. He grabbed Marcus by the collar, pulling him in front of him as a shield. "I'm not going back, you're not taking me back," the man howled. Mrs. Gable let out a piercing shriek. "Oh my God, do something, somebody do something!" She shrank back into her seat, pressing herself against Elias, her previous bravado vanishing into a puddle of raw, hysterical fear. "He's going to kill us, help me." Elias didn't move, not yet. He was calculating. The intruder was approximately 8 feet away. Marcus was in the line of fire. The intruder was agitated, likely suffering a mental health crisis or under the influence, which made him unpredictable. "Open the door," the man yelled again, kicking at the cockpit bulkhead. "Sir," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was incredibly steady. It was the voice of a man who owned the room. The intruder spun his gaze toward Elias. "Shut up, stay in your seat, old man." "I'm staying right here," Elias said, slowly raising his hands to chest height, palms open. "But you're hurting the flight attendant. He doesn't have the key. Nobody has a key. It's a deadbolt from the inside." "You're lying." Mrs. Gable was sobbing now, a frantic, rhythmic sound. "Give him what he wants, just let him in, please." "Mrs. Gable, be quiet," Elias said, his tone commanding. It wasn't a request. Surprisingly, she gasped and fell silent, shocked by the authority in his voice. "The move." Elias kept his eyes locked on the intruder's eyes. He saw the moment the man's focus wavered, a split-second glance toward the cockpit door. In that heartbeat, Elias moved. He didn't look like a mechanic anymore. He moved with the fluid, explosive grace of a predator. He cleared the space between the seats before the intruder could bring the glass shard around. Elias grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with a precise, sickening pop that forced the fingers to sprawl open. The glass hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. With his other hand, Elias drove a palm strike into the man's chest, backing him into the galley wall and pinning him there with his body weight. "Federal Air Marshal," Elias barked, his voice echoing through the cabin. "Stay down, do not resist." The word Air Marshal seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. The passengers in first class sat frozen, their mouths agape. Mrs. Gable stared, her poodle forgotten on the floor, as the man she had insulted for 2 hours expertly neutralized a life-threatening crisis. Elias reached into his waistband and produced a pair of heavy-duty flex cuffs. With practiced efficiency, he pulled the intruder's arms behind his back and cinched the plastic tight. "Marcus, get the zip ties from the kit," Elias ordered. "I need help securing his legs, he's a kicker." Marcus, shaking but fueled by adrenaline, nodded and moved to help. Together, they moved the now sobbing intruder to the floor of the galley, far from the cockpit door. The aftermath. The rest of the flight was a blur of protocol. Elias stayed on his feet, positioned by the galley, his eyes never leaving the cabin or the restrained man. The captain made an announcement about an unscheduled landing in Denver, and the atmosphere on the plane shifted from terror to a strange, hushed awe. As the plane began its descent, Elias returned to his seat to gather his duffel. He needed to be ready to hand the suspect over to the FBI and local police the moment the doors opened. Mrs. Gable was sitting very still. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't looking at her dog. She was looking at her hands. As Elias reached for his bag, she cleared her throat. It was a small, fragile sound. I didn't know," she whispered. Elias paused, looking down at her. The standards she had bragged about earlier seemed to have crumbled. Her hair was messy, and there was a smudge of mascara running down her cheek. "I know you didn't," Elias said. "I was so horrible to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I said those things about people like you. I thought I knew who you were just by looking at you." Elias zipped his bag. "Most people do, Mrs. Gable. That's usually how I prefer it. It helps me do my job." "But you saved us," she persisted, a tear finally escaping. "I was so ready to let that man through the door and you stood up. Why, after how I treated you?" Elias looked her in the eye. For the first time, he let her see the steel behind his gaze, the years of service, the quiet sacrifices, the dignity of a man who didn't need a designer suit to know his worth. Because people like me don't do this for the thanks or the seat or the premium experience, Elias said calmly. We do it because someone has to, and because, regardless of what you think, every person on this plane is worth saving, even the ones who think they're better than everyone else. The plane's tires hit the tarmac with a firm thud. The engines roared in reverse thrust, slowing the giant metal bird down. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate where blue and red lights were already flashing, Mrs. Gable reached out as if to touch his sleeve, then pulled back, realizing she no longer had the right. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." Elias stood up, slinging his duffel over his shoulder. He saw the authorities waiting at the jet bridge. His job here was almost done, and another flight, another invisible shift would begin tomorrow. He looked back at her one last time before stepping into the aisle. "Next time you look at someone, Mrs. Gable, try to see the person, not the clothes. You never know when the person you're looking down on is the only one who can keep you safe." He walked away, disappearing into the crowd of uniforms and investigators, once again becoming the ghost in the machinery. Mrs. Gable sat in seat 3B, surrounded by the luxury she had demanded, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. She finally understood that the most important person in the room wasn't the one with the most expensive ticket, but the one with the strongest character. And as the cabin doors opened, the people like him were the only ones everyone was looking for.